So here you are growing up in this family, and your dad is a high-ranking member of the Colombo family.
Right.
And you have siblings. You have a brother and a sister?
Yeah, I was one of 7, actually.
One of 7?
Yeah, I had
Okay.
2 brothers and all those sisters.
Okay, all the same parents?
Actually, my father was married once before, so
Okay.
he had 3 children from his first marriage.
Okay, then four children
Yes.
with your mother. Okay, so you have this family, and you're growing up, and then, as a kid, you don't really know anything different, but you're starting to get older, and you're seeing that your dad is a little different than the other dads. There's more police presence, and there's more secrecy, and so forth. So at what point did you start to realize what's going on?
Well, it was early on because my dad was one of the highest profile figures of his day. He was kind of like the John Gotti of his day, if you can make that comparison. But law enforcement tactics against organized crime were different back then than they are today. Today everything is very covert, undercover informants, high-tech surveillance equipment. Back then, when you were under investigation, they wanted you to know about it. And my dad was under investigation maybe for a period of about 10 years, growing up in Brooklyn, later on Long Island, from 7 or 8 different agencies. And they would all have a big presence in our lives. They'd have their cars parked around our house 24/7. So whenever we would go anywhere as a family, we had a parade of law enforcement vehicles following us. So, I had a lot of scuffles with them early on, and their presence was there. So I grew up really hating the police. I hated the government, hated law enforcement.
So you would argue with the undercover cops, like in front of your house and so forth?
Yeah, I'd lead them on a wild goose chase if they thought my dad was with me, and they did some things to get even with me. And, so I always had scuffles with them along the way.
How is your dad doing his business if there's literally someone following him as soon as he comes home? As soon as he leaves the house to the point where he comes home again?
Well, he had to be very careful. If he had a meeting that he didn't want them involved in, he had to have an escape route. One of the ways we do it, we had homes in Brooklyn. We had a big family. My dad was one of 19, so he had relatives everywhere in Brooklyn. So he'd go in the door of one house, go through the backyard, into the other house, go out the front door of the others where I had somebody waiting, and the cops were still waiting for him at the other house. So when we were under surveillance, we had to devise different ways to try to shake the tail that we had.
Okay. So you had a high school graduation party.
Yeah.
And something interesting happened with that whole situation.
Yeah. Well, it was in our backyard. My dad put up a big tent, and we had entertainment. We had probably 500 people there, and all of my friends, they drove their cars, obviously, or they borrowed somebody's car to come to the event. And the police were around, detectives, Nassau County, I should say, and they took the license plate number of every car in the neighborhood, every single car. So several weeks later, friends of mine are starting to get subpoenas to go to the grand jury. And it was all about them attending, my graduation party. And if they drove somebody else's car, and that person wasn't even at the event, they got the subpoena because that's where they got the name from, that license plate number. So that was...
Okay. In high school, was there a level of, hey, that's Michael, that's the son of so-and-so, you don't really want to mess with them? That type of thing, or were you just a regular high school kid?
Look, guys knew who my father was, and it was a thrill to some of them, to be around me, and to others, they didn't care. But, when I was younger, I had some issues of it because my dad had publicity, and you got a Mafia father, and, I'd fight, so it was that kind of a thing early on. But it didn't hurt me too much, in that regard.
So during this whole time, your dad was not involving you in any of this. He wasn't mentioning it at home, nothing.
Oh, my dad wanted me to go to school and be a doctor.
Okay.
I was an athlete in school. He was very supportive of me as an athlete, attended all my games, and he wanted me to be legitimate.
Okay. So you graduated high school, you go to college, and then your dad gets busted.
Yeah, in the early 60s, my dad was indicted several times, 3 times in the state of New York. Very serious crimes, grand larceny, homicide. Homicide was in Queens, actually. And he went to trial on all 3 of those cases over a period of a couple of years. He was acquitted, found not guilty. But then in 66, the feds indicted him for masterminding a nationwide string of bank robberies. He was convicted in 67 and sentenced to 50 years in prison. 1970, after he lost his appeals, he gets shipped off to Leavenworth Penitentiary to do his time, to begin his sentence. And I was a pre-med student, Hofstra University at that point. I was going to be a doctor, and I was devastated when Dad went in. He was 50 when he went in. I figured add 50 on top of that, he'd never come out of prison alive. So it was devastating.
Okay, and at that point, you started thinking about the whole mafia thing.
Well, what really happened, no, I can't say that. Joe Colombo had started the Italian-American Civil Rights League. What happened, his son, Joe Jr., had gotten indicted by the feds on some case for melting down coins for their silver value or something crazy like that. So Joey called us all up, you know, and he said, hey, my son is being framed. We're not going to have this happen anymore to any of us. He said, we want to go down to the FBI building on 69th Street and 3rd Avenue in Manhattan. We're going to picket the FBI. So for me, hey, great. They framed my father. This is a chance for me to maybe help my dad out. So I was one of the first to be on that picket line. And I was a kid. I was 18, 19 years old. And that's how I started to get involved with people on that line.